Give me the fat one.
The year was 1878, and the Idaho winters were unforgiving enough to freeze a man's soul. Owen Cole didn't come down the mountain for a fragile beauty to warm his bed. He came for survival. When 10 desperate women stood before him, he pointed past the corsets and lace. Give me the fat one. The Bitterroot Mountains cared nothing for the men who tried to tame them. Owen Cole knew this better than anyone breathing. At 39, his face was a map of harsh lessons, leathery, wind-burned skin, a jagged, pale scar running from his left temple to his jawline, courtesy of a cornered cougar, and eyes the color of a winter sky right before a blizzard. He had lived in a hand-hewn cabin near Lolo Pass for 6 years, trapping beaver, hunting elk, and panning the freezing creeks for the gold dust that kept him in powder and coffee. But the winter of 77 had nearly broken him. It wasn't the cold that got to him, nor the hunger. It was the suffocating, absolute silence. He had watched his partner, an old mule skinner named Caleb Higgins, die of a burst appendix in the dead of January. Owen had dug the grave in earth as hard as iron, and for 4 months he hadn't spoken a single word to another human being. When the spring thaw finally turned the snowmelt into roaring rivers, Owen made a decision. He needed a wife. Not a companion for polite conversation, but a partner. Someone who could salt meat, chop cordwood, fire a Winchester rifle, and keep the suffocating madness of the mountain winter at bay. He rode his dappled gelding, Barnaby, down the treacherous trails toward the lumber and mining town of Orofino, leading 2 pack mules loaded with prime pelts and a heavy leather pouch of pure river gold. The journey took 4 grueling days. When he finally rode into Orofino, the town was a chaotic sea of mud, shouting loggers, and the sharp scent of cut pine mixed with cheap whiskey. Owen tied his animals outside the Clearwater Mercantile. He knew a broker operated out of the back room of the town's boarding house, a slick-haired opportunist named Jeremiah Flint who arranged passage for destitute women from the east, trading them like livestock to lonely miners and ranchers for a hefty commission. Owen didn't like the business, but the frontier was no place for delicate morals. It was a place for survival. He found Flint standing on the covered porch of the boarding house, a cheap cigar clamped between his teeth, holding a ledger. Behind him, huddled like a flock of terrified, rain-soaked sheep, were 10 women. They had just arrived on the morning stagecoach from the railhead in Lewiston. The journey from Street Lewis had clearly taken its toll. Owen stood at the bottom of the steps, his thumbs hooked into his heavy leather gun belt. He smelled of wood smoke, animal fat, and sweat. The women stared at him with a mixture of horror and desperate hope. "Mr. Cole," Flint exclaimed, rubbing his hands together. "A pleasure to see you down from the clouds. I received the message you sent with the Dubois brothers last month. As you can see, I have brought a veritable garden of prairie flowers, straight from the civilized world of Missouri. Prime stock, young, healthy, and eager to please." Owen didn't say a word to Flint. His icy blue eyes swept over the line of women. It was a pathetic sight. To his far left was a waif of a girl, couldn't be more than 17, clutching a tattered lace handkerchief and coughing a wet, rattling sound that meant her lungs would likely freeze solid by November. Next to her was a pale blonde, weeping openly into her hands, wearing a silk dress that was entirely useless against the mountain winds. There were women with hollow cheeks, women trembling in fear, women who looked like they would shatter if a stiff breeze hit them. They were bakers' daughters, seamstresses, and widows of the city's soft, fragile, and utterly unprepared for the brutality of the Bitterroot Range. Flint stepped down, gesturing to a pretty, dark-haired woman in the center. "Now, Mr. Cole, take a look at Abigail here, 22 years old, reads the good book, and has a smile that could melt the winter snow. For a man of your stature, and considering the quality of gold you usually carry, I'd be willing to part with her contract for $70. Abigail looked up at Owen, her eyes wide with terror. She forced a trembling, unnatural smile, clearly hoping to be chosen by anyone who could get her out of this muddy hellhole, yet simultaneously terrified of the giant, scarred mountain man before her. Owen looked at Abigail's hands. They were pale, smooth, and unblemished. She had never held an axe. She had never skinned a deer. If she came to his cabin, she would be dead by Christmas, and he would be digging another grave in the frozen dirt. His eyes moved down the line, dismissing them one by one. Too fragile, too sick, too soft. Then he reached the end of the line. Standing slightly apart from the others was a woman who didn't look terrified at all. She looked furious. She was not like the other prairie flowers. Where the other women were slender and gaunt from the journey, she was broad and heavily built. She stood with her feet planted firmly apart, her thick arms crossed over her chest. She had a square jaw, a wide, flat nose, and a complexion ruddy from the wind, completely devoid of powder or paint. Her dark hair was pulled back into a severe, utilitarian knot, though several thick strands had escaped to frame her face. What caught Owen's attention most was what she was wearing. While the others shivered in their thin cottons and silks, this woman was bundled into an oversized, heavy wool man's coat that looked like it had been patched together from horse blankets. It made her look even larger, almost bear-like in her proportions. Owen looked at her hands. They were resting on her forearms, thick fingers, calloused, with dirt beneath the short-clipped nails. There was a dark, fading bruise on her left cheekbone, and her brown eyes glared back at Owen with an intense, burning defiance. She wasn't asking to be saved. She was daring him to try and break her. "Who is that?" Owen asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that made a few of the nearer women flinch. Flint sighed, looking exasperated. "Ah, that would be Martha Higgins. Mr. Cole, I assure you, you don't want to trouble yourself there. She was a last-minute addition from the slums of Street Lewis. Ate twice her share of the rations on the trail, and she's got a mouth on her that would make a bullwhacker blush. Refused to wear the dresses I provided. She's difficult, she's heavy on the provisions, and frankly, she's unappealing." Now, if you look back at Abigail, Owen didn't look back at Abigail. He stepped up onto the porch, towering over Flint. He kept his eyes locked on the heavy-set woman in the wool coat. She didn't look away. In fact, she lifted her chin, her jaw tightening. "Give me the fat one," Owen said flatly. A collective gasp echoed from the line of women. Flint blinked, his mouth falling open. I beg your pardon, mister." "Cole? Martha?" "You heard me," Owen said, reaching into his heavy coat and pulling out a small leather pouch. He tossed it to Flint. It hit the matchmaker's chest with a heavy, satisfying thud. "There's 3 ounces of prime river dust in there. Covers her contract, your fee, and whatever food she ate on your damn wagons." Owen ignored the registry. He walked straight over to Martha. Up close, he realized she was nearly as tall as his shoulder, a rarity for women of the time. She smelled of stale sweat, wool, and something else, something metallic, like gun oil. "Get your things," Owen said. "I'm wearing my things," Martha replied. Her voice was surprisingly deep, raspy, and devoid of any southern drawl. It was a hard, Midwestern bark. "Good. Saves time. We got a long ride before dark." Owen turned on his heel and walked toward his horses. For a moment, he wondered if she would follow. He didn't look back. A few seconds later, he heard the heavy, deliberate crunch of her boots in the mud behind him. At the horses, Owen pointed to one of the pack mules. "You know how to ride?" "I know how to sit on an animal," Martha said, eyeing the mule. "Don't expect me to look pretty doing it." Owen grabbed the mule's harness and hoisted a worn saddle onto it. "I didn't pay for pretty. I paid for someone who won't freeze to death when the snow hits the roofline." He offered her a hand up. Martha looked at his scarred, massive hand for a moment, then ignored it. She grabbed the saddle horn, planted her boot in the stirrup, and hauled her substantial weight up onto the mule with surprising agility. As she settled into the saddle, her heavy wool coat parted slightly. Owen caught a brief, sharp glimpse of something unnatural beneath the fabric. The coat was incredibly thick, almost padded, but before he could inspect it, she quickly yanked the coat closed, clutching the lapels tightly together with a fierce, protective grip. "Mind your eyes, mountain man," she snapped. Owen gave a short, humorless grunt. "Keep your secrets, Martha Higgins. Just keep up." The journey back up the Bitterroot Trail was brutal. The elevation climbed rapidly, the air growing thinner and significantly colder. The trail was narrow, flanked by sheer drops on one side and towering pines on the other. Owen pushed the pace, wanting to put as much distance between them and Orofino as possible before nightfall. Through it all, Martha didn't utter a single word of complaint. She didn't cry out when the mule stumbled on loose shale. She didn't whimper when the freezing wind began to bite through the trees. Owen watched her out of the corner of his eye. Her face was set in a mask of grim determination. She rode with a heavy, solid balance, a woman who knew hardship intimately. By dusk, they made camp near a bend in the Clearwater River, the water rushing violently over jagged black rocks. Owen built a fire efficiently, striking flint to dry moss. He expected Martha to sit by and wait to be served, like the city women he had seen in the past. Instead, without being asked, she slid off her mule, gathered a massive armful of damp deadwood, and began arranging a windbreak. Owen tossed her a tin of hardtack and a chunk of salted venison. She caught it seamlessly, tearing into the tough meat with strong teeth. "You got a past, Martha," Owen said quietly, pouring coffee into a tin cup. It wasn't a question. She stopped chewing, staring into the flames. "Everyone in this God-forsaken territory has a past, Mr. Cole. The smart ones don't ask about it." "I'm not asking. I'm telling," Owen said, taking a sip of the scalding coffee. "You flinch when someone stands on your left side. You guard that oversized coat like it's a newborn babe. And your name is Higgins. Same name as my old trapping partner who died on my floor last winter." Martha's eyes snapped up to meet his, a flicker of genuine shock crossing her stoic face. But before she could formulate a response, the sharp crack of a dry branch breaking in the woods echoed over the roar of the river. Owen didn't hesitate. In one fluid motion, he dropped his coffee, drew his heavy Colt revolver, and cocked the hammer, pointing it into the darkness of the tree line. "Step into the light, slow and easy," Owen commanded, his voice carrying over the rushing water. From the shadows, two men emerged. They were drifters, covered in trail dust, their clothes ragged. One was tall and painfully thin. The other was built like a rain barrel, clutching a rusted Spencer carbine. They held their free hands up, smirking. "Easy now, neighbor," the tall one drawled, stepping closer to the firelight. We smelled the coffee. Just a couple of weary travelers looking to share a fire. "Name's Gus. This here is Ned." Owen didn't lower his gun. "Fire's crowded. Move on." The heavyset man, Ned, ignored Owen. His greedy eyes had locked onto Martha, who was still sitting on a log, her heavy coat pulled tight around her. Ned's smirk widened into an ugly, yellow-toothed grin. "Well, I'll be damned," Ned breathed, taking a step forward. "Gus, look here. Ain't that a familiar face? All the way from Street Louie's." We finally caught up to the butcher's widow. Owen's eyes flicked to Martha. Her face had drained of color, turning a sickly white beneath the firelight. But she wasn't cowering. Slowly, her right hand slipped deep into the massive pocket of her heavy wool coat. "I told you," Martha whispered, her voice vibrating with a terrifying, cold hatred. "You come near me again, Ned, and I'll put a hole in you so big the devil can walk right through it." Suddenly Martha's hand whipped out of her coat. In her grip was not a lady's derringer, but a massive, heavy-barreled Remington, .44, and it was aimed dead center at Ned's chest. Owen realized then that the heavy coat wasn't just to keep her warm. It was hiding an arsenal, and God only knew what else. The fat bride he had bought wasn't just a survivor. She was a woman on the run, and she had just brought the war to his mountain. The heavy silence of the Bitterroot Wilderness shattered with the deafening roar of Martha's Remington. Ned didn't even have time to register the fact that a woman had drawn on him. The heavy, .44 caliber slug caught him high in the right shoulder, spinning his barrel-chested frame like a child's top. His rusted Spencer carbine fired wildly into the dirt as he collapsed, screaming into the mud and damp pine needles. Gus, the tall drifter, panicked. He scrambled backward, clawing at his belt for a rusted Navy Colt, his eyes wide with sudden, violent terror. He never cleared leather. Owen didn't blink. His Colt barked once, a sharp, clean sound over the rushing river. The bullet took Gus in the kneecap. The tall man shrieked, his leg giving out instantly, sending him crashing into the scrub oak. In the span of 3 seconds, the campfire had transformed from a quiet standoff into a slaughterhouse. Smoke hung thick and acrid in the freezing air, mixing with the smell of iron and terrified sweat. Owen kept his weapon leveled on the brush where Gus lay groaning, but his eyes slid over to the woman he had just purchased for 3 ounces of gold. Martha hadn't moved an inch. Her stance was still wide, her grip on the smoking, Remington steady. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't weeping. She looked like a woman who had just swatted a nuisance fly. "I warned him," Martha said flatly, lowering the hammer of her gun with a heavy thumb. "You did," Owen agreed, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He holstered his Colt and stepped over to Ned, kicking the dropped carbine into the river. He looked down at the bleeding, weeping man, then turned his icy gaze back to Martha. "Now, you want to tell me why 2 drifters from Missouri tracked a fat mail-order bride all the way up the Clearwater, calling her the butcher's widow?" Martha stood frozen for a long moment. She looked at the blood soaking into the snow around Ned, then up at Owen's scarred face. The absolute isolation of the mountains seemed to press down on them. Finally, she let out a long, ragged sigh, the fight momentarily draining out of her. "Because I'm not a bride, Mr. Cole," she said softly, "and I'm not fat." She set her revolver carefully on the log. With stiff, deliberate fingers, she reached up and began to unfasten the crude, horn buttons of the massive wool coat. Owen watched, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. As the thick wool parted, the firelight illuminated what lay beneath. It wasn't flesh. It was a custom-made, heavy leather corset stitched with reinforced canvas. And sewn into every square inch of that canvas were bulging, tightly sealed oilskin pouches. "My husband was William Higgins," Martha said, her voice dropping to a hard whisper. "They called him the Butcher down in the Street Louis rail yards. He was a collector and a leg breaker for the O'Bannon syndicate. He was a vicious, cruel bastard, Mr. Cole. For 5 years, I lived with his fists and his whiskey breath. 3 months ago, the O'Bannons decided Will was getting too ambitious. They shot him dead in our kitchen." She reached into one of the pouches and pulled out a thick stack of tightly bound, high-denomination banknotes, tossing them onto the dirt near Owen's boots. "Will wasn't a smart man, but he was paranoid," Martha continued. "He'd been skimming from the syndicate for years, hiding the cash, along with 2 ledgers detailing every bribe judge, bought politician, and murder the O'Bannons, commissioned since 1870. When they killed him, they tore the house apart looking for it. They didn't find it because I already had it. I packed $40,000 and the ledgers into this vest, put on his biggest winter coat, and ran." Owen stared at the money in the dirt. $40,000. It was a sum so large it sounded imaginary up here in the pines, where a man could live a year on $50. "Caleb Higgins," Owen said, the pieces snapping together in his mind. "My partner. He was Will's kin." Martha nodded. "Will's uncle. Caleb wrote to us last year, bragging about a gold claim up at Lolo Pass. Said it was the edge of the world. The O'Bannons own the police in Missouri, Mr. Cole. They own the stagecoach lines and the Pinkertons. I needed to get off the map. I used the last of my pocket change to buy a spot on Jeremiah Flint's bride wagon, hoping to find Caleb's cabin. I didn't know he was dead until I heard you tell Flint your name." Owen looked from Martha to the 2 bleeding men on the ground. Gus was still whining in the brush. Ned was losing consciousness. "These 2? Owen asked. "Bounty hunters," Martha spat, her lip curling in disgust. "The O'Bannons put $10,000 on my head, dead or alive. They must have recognized me when the wagons passed through Lewiston." Owen fell silent. The wind howled through the canyon, carrying the promise of a brutal winter. He had gone to Orofino to buy a woman to help him survive the snow. Instead, he had bought a walking treasury, a syndicate target, and a war. Any sane man would take his gold back, put a bullet in her, to collect the bounty, and ride away. Owen walked over to the stack of banknotes. He picked them up, dusted off the dirt, and held them out to her. "Keep it hidden," Owen said, his voice void of emotion. "The mountains don't care about paper money, and neither do I." Martha looked at him, stunned. "You're not going to turn me in?" "I signed a contract," Owen said. turning his back on her to tend to his horses. I paid 3 ounces for a partner who can shoot, ride, and survive. Seems to me you fit the bill better than any delicate flower in that lineup. Now help me tie these 2 idiots to their horses. We'll leave them on the trail for the nearest marshal to find. We need to reach the cabin before the blizzard hits. The ascent to Owen's claim took 2 more days of grueling, bone-chilling travel. By the time they reached the clearing at Lolo Pass, the first major snowstorm of the season had already begun, laying a thick, white blanket over the jagged peaks. The cabin was a fortress of notched pine logs, heavily chinked with mud and horsehair, perched on a rocky shelf overlooking a vast, frozen valley. It was Spartan, smelling intensely of wood smoke, dried herbs, and old leather. There was one heavy iron stove, a single massive bed piled high with furs, a sturdy oak table, and walls lined with traps, tools, and cured pelts. Home, Owen grunted, pushing the heavy oak door open against the wind. If Martha was disappointed by the primitive conditions, she didn't show it. She stepped inside, immediately shedding the massive wool coat and the heavy money-laden vest, hiding them beneath a loose floorboard near the stove. Without waiting for instructions, she found the wood box, fed the dying embers in the stove, and began unpacking their meager supplies. The first 3 weeks were a masterclass in silent endurance. They moved around each other in the confined space like 2 wary wolves sharing a den. Owen had spent so long in isolation that words felt heavy and unnecessary on his tongue. Martha, traumatized by a violent past and a terrifying flight, guarded her thoughts fiercely. Yet, a strange, undeniable rhythm developed between them. Owen gave her the bed. He slept on a pallet of bearskins near the door, his Winchester always within reach. He expected her to falter when he brought in a freshly killed elk, but Martha simply rolled up her sleeves, took his hunting knife, and butchered the animal with a grim, practiced efficiency that rivaled his own. She didn't complain about the cold that seeped through the floorboards. She didn't weep when her hands blistered from chopping frozen cordwood. In the evenings, while the wind screamed against the roof, Owen would clean his traps, and Martha would mend their gear by the weak light of a tallow candle. Slowly, the ice began to thaw. It started with small things. Owen noticing that Martha always left the best cut of meat in his tin bowl. Martha noticing that Owen quietly chopped an extra pile of kindling so she wouldn't have to go out in the morning frost. He sat at the table, jaw clenched, trying to awkwardly bandage it one-handed. Martha walked over, gently but firmly batting his hand away. "You're making a mess of it," she murmured, her rough voice softer than he had ever heard it. She washed the wound with hot water and carbolic soap, her thick, calloused fingers moving with surprising tenderness. She stitched the gash with needle and catgut, a painful process that Owen endured without a flinch. When she finished, she wrapped it tight in clean linen. Owen looked down at her hands, capable, strong, survivalist hands. Then he looked up into her face. The bruises from her past had faded, replaced by the wind-whipped flush of mountain living. In the amber glow of the firelight, stripped of her heavy armor and her defensive rage, she was striking. "You've got a good hand for stitching, Martha," Owen said quietly. Martha kept her eyes on the bandage, her breath catching slightly. "Will used to come home cut up from bar fights. I had a lot of practice." She finally looked up, her brown eyes locking onto his. "You're a hard man to figure out, Owen Cole. You know I have a bounty on my head that could buy you a mansion in San Francisco. You know I'm trouble. Why are you keeping me here?" "Because you pull your weight," Owen answered honestly, his gaze steady. He reached out with his good hand, his rough thumb lightly brushing a stray lock of dark hair behind her ear. It was the first time he had touched her with anything resembling gentleness. And because out here, a man learns to value iron over gold. "Your iron, Martha." A flicker of genuine warmth, something resembling hope, passed over Martha's face. For a moment, the vast, freezing world outside ceased to exist. But the mountains are cruel, and they do not allow peace to linger. The next morning, the storm broke, leaving a blindingly bright, cloudless sky. Owen stepped out onto the porch to gather wood, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He glanced down the mountain, scanning the tree line out of sheer habit. His blood ran cold. A mile down the ridge, Moving slowly but deliberately through the deep snowdrifts was a line of dark figures. 10 men on horseback, leading pack mules. They were heavily armed, wearing thick dusters and carrying repeating rifles. And riding at the front of the pack, wrapped in a heavy fur coat, pointing a gloved hand directly toward Owen's cabin, was Jeremiah Flint. The O'Bannons hadn't just sent 2 drifters. They had sent a small army, and Flint, smelling blood and money, had sold out the location of Caleb Higgins's old claim. Owen stepped back inside, bolting the heavy oak door. He turned to Martha, who was standing by the stove, holding a steaming cup of coffee. She saw the look in his eyes, and the warmth instantly drained from her face. "Get your vest," Owen said, grabbing his Winchester from the wall and racking the lever with a sharp, metallic clack, "and load every gun we have in this cabin." The heavy oak door slammed shut, the iron bolt sliding into place with a definitive, echoing thud. Inside the dim cabin, the air instantly thickened with the sharp, metallic tang of adrenaline and gun oil. Owen moved with a fluid, lethal grace honed by years of surviving the unforgiving wild. He kicked out the wooden wedges, holding the window shutters open, plunging the room into shadow, save for the flickering amber glow of the wood stove. Martha didn't panic. She didn't scream or ask pointless questions. She dropped to her knees, prying up the loose floorboard. She bypassed the heavy canvas corset filled with $40,000 and instead grabbed a heavy burlap sack. She dumped its contents onto the rough-hewn table. 2 boxes of .44 caliber cartridges, a rusted but functional double-barreled shotgun, and a heavy Sharps buffalo rifle Caleb had left behind. "How many?" she asked, her voice tight but remarkably steady as she began shoving fat brass cartridges into the loops of a leather bandolier. 10, Owen replied, taking his position by the narrow firing slit carved into the front log wall. He wiped a patch of frost from the wood, peering down the ridge. Heavily armed, they're moving slow because of the drifts, but they've got the high ground surrounded. Flint brought them right to the slaughter. Martha moved beside him, hauling the heavy Sharps rifle up to the adjacent slit. "I know the men riding with Flint. The big one in the beaver hat is Irish Tommy Gallagher. He's a knee-breaker for the O'Bannons. The others look like city muscle, probably thugs who bribe the real street. Louis Chief of Police, James McDonough, to look the other way. They aren't mountain men, Owen. They don't know this terrain." "They don't have to," Owen grunted, cocking his Winchester. "They just have to put enough lead through these walls to turn us into Swiss cheese." Outside, the crunch of heavy boots in the snow ceased. The wind howled, a low, mournful sound, before Jeremiah Flint's weasel-like voice cut through the freezing air. "Mr. Cole," Flint shouted, his voice echoing off the sheer rock face of the pass. He was using a massive pine trunk for cover about 50 yards down the slope. "There is no need for bloodshed. I am a reasonable businessman. You harbor a fugitive, sir. The men with me are duly deputized agents of the law from Missouri. Send out the woman and the ledgers, and they will leave you to your peace. I will even refund your 3 ounces of gold." Owen didn't answer. He looked at Martha. Her jaw was set like granite, her brown eyes dark and furious. "He's lying," Martha whispered harshly. "The O'Bannons don't leave witnesses. If I walk out there, they'll shoot us both and burn the cabin to hide the evidence." "I know," Owen said softly. He reached out, his rough, scarred hand covering hers on the stock of the rifle. "I didn't buy a coward, Martha, and I don't surrender what's mine." Martha's breath hitched. In the cold, terrifying shadow of impending death, the mountain man had just claimed her. Not as property, but as a partner. Martha leaned closer to the firing slit and raised her voice, letting her raspy, booming Midwestern bark carry over the snow. "Hey, Gallagher!" she roared. Down the slope, the big man in the beaver hat shifted behind a rock. "Did Flint tell you what's actually in this cabin?" Martha yelled, her voice dripping with venom. "Did he tell you about the $40,000 in pure banknotes I took from my dead husband? Or did he just tell you about the $10,000 bounty? Because I'm guessing that greasy rat plans on taking the cash for himself while you freeze to death doing his dirty work." Silence descended on the ridge, a heavy, pregnant silence that had nothing to do with the snow. "Shut up, you lying sow!" Flint shrieked, panic suddenly lacing his tone. "Gallagher, don't listen to her. Open fire. Burn them out." But the seed of doubt, planted in the fertile soil of greedy men, instantly sprouted. "Hold on a minute, Flint," Gallagher's deep voice rumbled. "You didn't mention nothing about 40 grand. "It's a trick!" Flint screamed. He raised his revolver and fired a wild shot at the cabin. The bullet splintered the log a foot above Owen's head. That single shot broke the tension. The Missouri thugs, eager for blood and confused by the promise of hidden wealth, opened fire. A hail of lead slammed into the cabin. The heavy pine logs shuddered, wood chips flying into the air like lethal shrapnel. A bullet shattered the cast-iron coffee pot on the stove, sending a hiss of steam and boiling water across the floor. Owen didn't flinch. He sighted his Winchester, exhaled slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked. A man in a brown duster, screaming and charging up the left flank, dropped like a stone, clutching his chest. Martha was right beside him. The heavy Sharps rifle roared, kicking back violently into her shoulder. The massive .50 caliber slug tore through a rotting stump where another thug was hiding, taking the man's arm off at the elbow. His screams echoed terribly across the valley. "Two down!" Owen yelled, over the deafening roar of incoming fire. But there were still 8 men, and they were laying down a suppressing fire that made it impossible to peek through the slits. Lead chewed through the mud, chinking. The cabin was strong, but it wouldn't hold forever. "They're moving up the blind side," Martha warned, dropping the Sharps and drawing her massive Remington, .44, bracing herself against the doorframe. Owen knew the geography of his claim better than he knew his own heartbeat. He knew the fatal flaw of the terrain the thugs were using. The ridge above them was a sheer 50-foot drop of unstable shale, currently buried under 6 feet of fresh, heavy snowpack. "Martha!" Owen shouted over the gunfire. "The floorboard! Under the money! There's a canvas bag of blasting powder and a roll of fuse. Get it!" Martha didn't hesitate. She crawled on her belly beneath the hail of bullets, her hands desperately digging under the floorboards. She tossed the heavy, waxy canvas bag to Owen. Owen grabbed a hunting knife, pierced the bag, and shoved a 2-foot length of fuse into the black powder. He tied it off tight with a leather strip. "When I open the shutter, give me covering fire," Owen ordered. He struck a match against the iron stove. It flared to life. Martha knelt by the window, her Remington gripped in both hands. "Do it!" Owen kicked the wooden wedge, throwing the heavy shutter open. The cold wind blasted in, accompanied by a fresh volley of bullets. Martha rose, firing her .44 blindly but rapidly into the tree line, forcing the approaching men to duck for cover. Owen lit the fuse. It sparked and hissed violently. He stepped to the open window, his massive shoulder muscles bunching as he hurled the heavy bag of powder high and hard. It soared through the freezing air, sailing over the heads of the pinned-down gunmen, and landed deep in the snowdrift on the sheer ridge directly above them. "Get down!" Owen roared, tackling Martha to the floor just as the fuse met the powder. The explosion was catastrophic. It didn't just rattle the cabin. It felt as though the earth itself had been cracked in two. A deafening, concussive boom echoed off the peaks, followed instantly by a sound that every mountain man dreads, a deep, low, structural groan. The shockwave had shattered the fragile hold of the snowpack. Owen and Martha lay on the floorboards, hands over their ears, as the mountain unleashed its fury. Thousands of tons of snow, ice, and jagged rock sheared off the ridge. The avalanche roared down the slope like a white, churning ocean, snapping 100-year-old pines like toothpicks. They couldn't hear the screams of the Missouri thugs. They could only hear the thunderous roar of the slide as it swept past the cabin, taking Flint, Gallagher, and the entire syndicate hit squad over the sheer cliff face and down into the bottomless, frozen gorge below. The cabin shook violently, snow burying the front porch and blocking the windows, plunging them into total darkness. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the world fell deathly silent. For a long time, neither of them moved. They lay tangled together on the floor, breathing heavily, the smell of cordite and dust thick in their lungs. Slowly, Owen pushed himself up. He struck another match, lighting the tallow candle on the table. He looked down at Martha. She was covered in wood chips and dirt, her hair wild, her breathing ragged. She looked up at him, and for the first time since he had seen her standing in the mud in Orofino, she smiled. It wasn't a pretty, fragile smile. It was the fierce, triumphant grin of a survivor. Owen reached down, grabbing her thick, calloused hand, and pulled her to her feet. He didn't say a word. He just pulled her heavy, solid frame against his chest and buried his face in her hair. She wrapped her arms around him, gripping him with a strength that rivaled his own. The spring thaw of 1879 came late to the Bitterroots. When the trails finally cleared, a giant of a man with a scarred face and a broad, formidable woman rode down into the valley. They didn't stop in Orofino. They kept riding west, carrying a heavy canvas corset and a ledger that would soon mysteriously find its way to the Missouri governor, tearing the O'Bannon Syndicate apart from the inside out. Historical records from the Idaho Territory eventually listed Owen and Martha Cole as the founders of the largest horse and cattle operation north of the Salmon River. The syndicate crumbled a year later when a mysterious ledger arrived at the Missouri governor's desk. The fragile prairie flowers of Orofino faded into history, but the legend of the scarred mountain man and his iron-willed bride remains carved into the Bitterroots.
Hi, my name is Ivy Duck Devotion, the owner and manager of Ivy Duck Devotion. After watching the video, Give Me the Fat One, Mountain Man said after being offered 10 male order brides, I really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stood out to me most was how easy it is for people to judge others based on appearances while completely missing the deeper qualities that truly matter. This story had a mix of humor, surprise, and sincerity, but underneath it all, it felt like a reminder that kindness, loyalty, and character often show up where people least expect them. Do you think the mountain man saw something in her that everyone else overlooked? And have you ever changed your opinion about someone after getting to know them better? I think stories like this encourage us to slow down a little and look past first impressions in our own lives too. If this video gave you something to think about, I'd really enjoy hearing your thoughts in the comments. And if you like mountain man stories with heart, humor, and a little human truth mixed in, feel free to like and subscribe only if you'd like to see more.